Today we are looking into one of Tolkien's most divisive and interesting characters, Fëanor, the Elven Smith. While much of Fëanor's legacy is largely negative, he was driven by his pride and extremely self-willed, to the point where he was willing to forsake the Blessed Realm, defy the Valar, lead his people into a hopeless war, and he did a little kinslaying. He is also described as being the greatest of the Eldar in arts and lore. So, to put it simply, there's quite a lot to hate about Fëanor, but there's also lots to love. Fëanor was the firstborn son of Finwë, and the only child of his wife Míriel. He was named by his father Finwë, but his mother called him Fëanor. Finwë means skilled son of Finwë, and Fëanor means spirit of fire. Tolkien writes that the spirit of Fëanor burned as a flame. Míriel, the mother of Fëanor, was consumed in body and spirit in the bearing of her son Fëanor, and was unable to continue living after his birth. After the death of Míriel, Finwë devoted his attention to raising his son, but was later remarried to an elf named Indis. Together they had 2 sons, Fingolfin and Finarfin. Fëanor had no love for his stepmother or half-brothers. Tolkien also notes, interestingly enough, that Fëanor was the most beloved of the sons of Finwë. Fëanor was married to an elf named Nerdanel, who was the daughter of a great elven smith called Matan. She bore him 7 sons. At first, she was able to restrain Fëanor, but ultimately they were estranged. The Noldor were favored by Aule, the craftsman of the Valar. Matan, the father-in-law of Fëanor, was most dear to Aule of all the Noldor, and thus learned many things from him. He then taught them to Fëanor, though he later regretted doing so. Fëanor became a great smith, and the greatest of all his creations were the Silmarils, 3 jewels which held within them the light of the 2 trees of Valinor. After his unchaining, Melkor sought to destroy the Noldor, and manipulated Fëanor to this end. Because of Melkor's manipulation, there became a great unrest among the Noldor, with Fëanor being seen as its chief instigator. Ultimately, Finwë summoned his sons and the other kindred to discuss this unrest. In this time, Fingolfin urged his father to denounce Fëanor's rebellious words and plans, and Fëanor accused Fingolfin of trying to usurp him. Fëanor drew his sword upon his half-brother, and with this, the unrest of the Noldor was no longer hidden, and Fëanor was blamed. The Valar brought Fëanor before the Ring of Doom, and he was sentenced to 12 Valyrian years in exile. Fëanor left Tirion, the city of the elves, and brought with him the Silmarils, which were locked away. In this time, Finwë went into exile with his son, and Fëanor's wife Nerdanel remained in Tirion with Fëanor's stepmother Indis. After a time, Melkor came to Fëanor and offered to help him. This was a thinly veiled attempt to gain the Silmarils for himself. However, Fëanor refused, and Melkor fled. In this time, the Valar searched but were unable to find Melkor. Ultimately, Melkor returned to Aman and destroyed the 2 trees of Valinor. The Valar then asked Fëanor to give them the Silmarils so that they could break them and use them to heal the trees. However, Fëanor refused. Shortly afterwards, messengers came from Formenos, where he had been exiled, with news that Melkor had killed Finwë and stolen the Silmarils. Fëanor cursed Melkor, naming him Morgoth, the black foe of the world. Fëanor then returned to Tirion against his banishment, and he began a great speech before the Noldor. In this speech, he claimed kingship of the Noldor and urged them to leave Valinor and take dominion of Middle-earth before the coming of men. He did this because Melkor had taught him that the Valar held the Eldar captive in Valinor so that men might rule Middle-earth. He then swore an oath to reclaim the Silmarils at any cost, and his sons joined him in this. This was called the Oath of Fëanor, and it would have a lasting impact on Middle-earth for centuries to come. The greater part of the Noldor agreed to leave Aman, but not all of them agreed to take Fëanor as their king. Many preferred Fingolfin for king, so 2 divided hosts departed. Before they could be on their way, a messenger from Manwë came and urged them not to go. Fëanor laughed and brushed off this warning. Fëanor then came to Alculande, and tried to persuade the Teleri to join them on their quest. But they would not join Feanor, nor would they aid him with their boats. So then Feanor tried to take the ships of the Teleri by force, and they withstood him, and a terrible battle followed. This was called the kinslaying of Alqualande, or the first kinslaying. Thus the Noldor killed many of their kin, and they took the ships and continued on. The Noldor were then met by a figure who cursed those who would not stay or seek the pardon of the Valar. But once again Feanor was not dissuaded, and so the doom of Mondos was pronounced upon them. Ye have spilled the blood of your kindred unrighteously, and have stained the land of Aman. For blood ye shall render blood, and beyond Aman ye shall dwell in death's shadow. Along the way he abandoned his half-brother Fingolfin in Araman, bringing with him only those he deemed worthy or loyal to himself. And eventually Feanor came to Middle-earth. As Feanor and his sons arrived in Middle-earth, they burnt their ships so no one else would be able to use them. Unbeknownst to them, and quite ironically, this scene drew the attention of the servants of Morgoth. The hosts of Feanor passed into the land of Hithlum and made their dwelling in Mithrim. There the servants of Morgoth attacked them in their encampment. The Noldor were victorious. After this battle, Feanor was driven mad in wrath, and believed that he could take on Morgoth himself. He rushed ahead of his hosts in battle and found himself alone, surrounded by the servants of Morgoth. There he was smitten to the ground by Gothmog, lord of Balrogs. His sons carried him back towards Mithrim, but he died along the way, and his body fell to ash as his fiery spirit left him. The legacy of Feanor. Where else can we read about Feanor? The letters of Tolkien. Letter 131. In this letter, Tolkien gives an introduction or account of Feanor and the Silmarils. He writes that the fall of the elves come through Feanor directly, writing, "But the chief artificer of the elves, Feanor, had imprisoned the light of Valinor in 3 supreme jewels, the Silmarils, before the trees were sullied or slain. This light thus lived thereafter only in these gems. The fall of the elves comes about through the possessive attitude of Feanor and his 7 sons to these gems." In letter 353, Tolkien writes that Galadriel was the enemy of Feanor. Galadriel was unstained. She had committed no evil deeds. She was an enemy of Feanor. She did not reach Middle-earth with the other Noldor, but independently. Her reasons for desiring to go to Middle-earth were legitimate, and she would have been permitted to depart, but for the misfortune that before she set out, the revolt of Feanor broke out, and she became involved in the desperate measures of Manwë and the ban on all emigration. We can also learn quite a bit more about Feanor in Unfinished Tales. Tolkien writes that Galadriel was wiser than Feanor. Galadriel was the greatest of the Noldor, except Feanor maybe, though she was wiser than he, and her wisdom increased with the long years. We also learn that Feanor had begged Galadriel for a tress of her hair, but was denied 3 times. Many thought that Galadriel's hair first gave to Feanor the thought of imprisoning and blending the light of the trees that later took shape in his hands as the Silmarils. For Feanor beheld the hair of Galadriel with wonder and delight. He begged 3 times for a tress, but Galadriel would not give him even 1 hair. These 2 kinsfolk, the greatest of the Eldar and Valinor, were unfriends forever. This story contextualizes Galadriel's decision in The Lord of the Rings to give Gimli 3 strands of her hair, which I always think is very delightful and fun. It's kind of like one of those good fun facts you can teach new Tolkien fans. Galadriel also perceived a darkness within Feanor that she hated and feared. Tolkien writes, "From her earliest years she had a marvelous gift of insight into the minds of others, but judged them with mercy and understanding. And she withheld her goodwill from none save only Feanor. In him she perceived a darkness that she hated and feared, though she did not perceive that the shadow of the same evil had fallen upon the minds of all the Noldor and upon her own." We also learn in Unfinished Tales that Sauron had success in Eregion with Celebrimbor, because Celebrimbor sought to rival the skill and fame of Feanor, who was his grandfather. Tolkien writes, "But Sauron had better fortune with the Noldor of Eregion, and especially with Celebrimbor, who desired in his heart to rival the skill and fame of Feanor." We can also learn quite a bit about Feanor in The Nature of Middle-earth. Tolkien explains that Feanor had 7 sons, but none surpassed him. Tolkien also explains in the section about timescales that Feanor was the most eminent case of a child of exceedingly great vigor, demanding great strength to go forth from the mother. It is also said that Feanor remained in his mother's womb for much longer than usual elvish pregnancies, so no wonder she was quite exhausted. Tolkien also explains that Feanor had long, dark hair. Along the same lines as we read in Unfinished Tales, it is explained in The Nature of Middle-earth that through Celebrimbor the story of Feanor is repeated, because Celebrimbor secretly sought to rival the fame of Feanor. Tolkien writes, Sauron sees that he has met his match, or at least a very serious adversary, in Galadriel. He dissembles his wrath and gets round Celebrimbor. The Noldoran smiths under Celebrimbor admit him and begin to learn from him, so in a sense the story of Feanor is repeated. In Morgoth's Ring, we can also learn that Melkor took credit for teaching or aiding Feanor in making the Silmarils, but that this was a complete lie, and Feanor was driven by his heart alone. There are also a few references to Feanor in The Lord of the Rings. In Book 2, Chapter 4, we can see that the Star of Feanor appears within the designs for the Doors of Durin. Now, these designs were made by Celebrimbor, so it can be suggested that he may have taken pride in his grandfather's legacy. In Book 3, Chapter 11 of The Lord of the Rings, Feanor is attributed to the creation of the Palantiri, the Seeing Stones. We can also see in Appendix E of The Lord of the Rings that Feanor is attributed to the creation of the Tangwar letters. So not only did Feanor create the Silmarils, and though these are his greatest legacy, he also created many other things that have a lasting impact on the history of Middle-earth. Feanor is an example of Tolkien's love for writing a character that is the greatest of their kind, and through their own pride experiences a very devastating fall. I think we also see this sort of character's journey within Sauron, and maybe even our Farazone as well. If you enjoyed this video about Feanor, I would love to hear your thoughts. Do you love him? Do you hate him? Did he do anything wrong? Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I would so appreciate if you shared it with a friend.